Welcome to Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance, joined today by Stan Mantooth. He is the Superintendent of Schools for Ventura County, an elected position. And it's really surprising that I'm going to be asking you about a teacher shortage, because 5 years ago, teachers were getting pink slips during the recession. Now, California is facing a serious crisis. We don't have enough teachers.
And Brad, first of all, it's a pleasure to be
here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
That's part of the problem. Interestingly enough, it goes back to money,
right,
or in this case, the lack thereof. When the voters approved Proposition 98 back in the 90s,
right,
this was seen as a panacea for education funding.
And of course, Prop 98 requires that 40% of state funds be spent on K-12.
That is absolutely correct. And the fatal flaw is the 40% is only as large as the 100% pie. And so when the recession hit us in 2007-8 and we experienced severe reductions in our funding, that meant we had to cut positions. We first stayed as far away from the classroom as we could, but at some point we had to kind of submit to the new normal, and thousands of teachers lost their jobs, hundreds in Ventura County.
Right, and as we speak today, there are, close to 50,000 teacher vacancies throughout the state. In the last decade, and I'm not surprised based upon what you said, we have 70% less individuals educating themselves to become teachers in California.
That's correct. So first, it's kind of a two-pronged problem. The first part is renewing the interest in education, because it used to be seen as a very secure field. Of course, it's a great one for making a contribution, and you can feel very altruistic about it. We attract really good people who are givers. But if it's seen as a transient kind of a job where you could be laid off from one year to the next, it's a deterrent.
I want to ask you about how we treat our teachers as a group. Because I feel as if, you've heard the cliche, we hate Congress, but we love our congressmen, our own congressmen. I feel as if we're getting to a place where teachers are being bashed. And so we hate the teachers, but we love our kids' teacher. And so do you think that kind of bashing the teachers unions, is that having an impact?
I think it's just as you say. The teaching profession and public education often gets demonized.
Right.
And with all due respect, by the press. And yet, when you talk about an individual child's teacher, those are everyday heroes. So there's a big disconnect there between the two.
You mentioned compensation. And the reality is that in terms of teacher salary in California, I understand we're about the 5th highest in the nation. But we do have a very high standard of living. And so I'm wondering, is it time for us to really dig deep and look at how we're paying our teachers?
Absolutely. And if it's not how we're paying our teachers, it's how do we help teachers overcome the debt that they're carrying when they join us fresh out of college.
And there are bills that have been bandied about to provide loan forgiveness. Former Senator Fran Pavley, who I think used to represent parts of Ventura County, looked at a loan forgiveness program. But we don't see a lot of movement in the end on those types of initiatives.
That's correct. And it's disappointing. It's frustrating. It won't stop us, fulfilling our mission, but it does hamper us in that first part of the first prong of the issue that I was talking about, and that's attracting teachers into the profession. Then once we're able to attract someone who gets a teaching credential, we need to make sure, number one, that we give them the right kind of follow-up training so they can really succeed in a classroom.
And that's another instance where we see teachers being bashed. The evaluations are too lax, you're not getting evaluated as often, you're getting tenure too quickly. These may be valid points, but that's, again, where the teachers feel as if they're being attacked.
Yeah, there's truth to all of that, but I think also it comes down to enlightened school leaders, enlightened school districts and school boards that really do value teachers, and the communities where these teachers work, valuing them as individuals. Because you can overcome deficits in compensation with respect and recognition.
I want to ask a question of you that was posed to a friend of mine who was a teacher. After the November election, a friend of mine who teaches in an inner city school was asked by one of her students whether she was going to be deported. Mm-hmm. And this teacher really didn't know how to answer the question. The student's birth was not clear to her because obviously if you're born in the country, whether your parents are undocumented, it's irrelevant. These are hard times for teachers and students, especially in California, where there are significant populations that may have been born elsewhere.
Correct.
You wrote a very powerful letter in the wake of the election. Talk to us about what's happening in Ventura County, which has growing Latino populations.
Okay. Well, on the heels of the November election, when President Trump prevailed, there was an almost immediate cloud of fear and uncertainty that settled over our, what I would say is our communities and our schools. Hundreds of students exercised their right of free speech to protest.
Right, in Oxnard, I believe?
In Oxnard High School District and other places, although that's where the largest concentration of high school students are. And, you know, concern not only about themselves, but about their families.
And that's an interesting point because a lot of the students, they may not be able, in their own mind, developmentally, to understand the distinctions, the intricacies of immigration law. But if, you know, if they have an aunt or a grandmother or even a father who's not born in this country, they are afraid they'll be deported with them. But still, the thought of losing your parent to deportation.
Right, it can be crushing. And we had students, examples of students, not only at the high school level, but elementary school students, inconsolable, actually crying at school.
So
really believing
that
the departure, the taking away of their families was imminent.
So what do you, as the superintendent for one of the bigger counties in our state, tell district leaders, teachers? Because if a student is asked a question, am I going to be deported? Is my mom going to be deported? We can't give an answer.
Right.
We probably not, but that's not going to help them.
We do our best to, number one, diffuse the tension.
Right.
Use it as a learning experience. You know, we're always trying to make lemonade out of lemons.
Course.
And to talk about the transition of power from
you talked about that in your
from
letter.
one party to the next, and finding the right things to say not only to the students but to their parents, because students spend more time at home than they do in our schools. So lowering the parents' anxiety as well as the students, and finding the right messaging to lower their anxiety level, and to explore what rights do schools and students have with the backdrop of this kind of crisis.
Right. Well, it's interesting. You remember I've talked about this when President Lyndon Johnson was looking to desegregate schools in the 60s. He told southern districts, if you don't desegregate, I'm going to withdraw federal funds. The new president's administration suggests the same. If you don't help us with immigration, we're going to withdraw federal funds.
Well,
where do you go with that?
The federal government contributes about 16% of our education dollars.
That's a real number.
It's a real number, it's real money. More importantly, that money goes to serve kids that are most at risk, special education kids, students of poverty, and English language learners. So to lose that funding is a very real
If you
problem.
can come back, I'd like to continue this conversation because we're just in the early days of a new administration, and I want to continue to see what happens next. His name is Stan Mantooth. He is the elected superintendent in Ventura County. My name is Brad Pomerance. We thank you so much for joining us on Local Edition.